Right. Good morning and good evening to some. Welcome everyone to today's session on net zero cities and specifically how California and Europe can achieve net zero cities together. My name is Puisan Tam and I am project manager for the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, EIT for short, in Silicon Valley based in San Francisco. We will start today's meeting with a few opening remarks from Sam Assefa, Director of the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, OPR for short, Thomas Osdoba, Director of NetZeroCities EU and Senior Cities Advisor at EIT Climate-KIC, so KIC stands for Knowledge and Innovation Communities, and Jay Ziegler, Vice Chair of the California Foundation on the Environment and the Economy. They will be followed by a presentation by Thomas Haddock and Charlotte May, both of EIT Climate-KIC. And after the presentations, we will have a Q&A moderated by Peter van Deventer, Director of the Coast to Coast Smart E-Mobility Program at OPR. And then we will end with some closing remarks by Neil Walmsley of EIT Climate-KIC. For this meeting, we really want to hear from you as well as city representative, as friends in the sustainability field, and we want to learn about your city's plans and ambitions and how you think the Net Zero Cities program can apply to your work in your respective communities. So please comment and ask lots of questions. You can put the questions in the chat box or during the Q&A session, you can just raise your hands, but we will wait with answering all these questions until after the presentations. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Sam Assefa. Sam is the Director of the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and prior to being appointed OPR Director, Sam was Director of the City of Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development. He has held high-level planning positions in Boulder, Chicago, and San Francisco as well. So we are delighted to have Sam here to give us a few opening remarks. Sam?
Great, thank you, Pew, and thank you for having me here. I just want to say good morning to everyone and would like to welcome you, all participants from California cities, regions, and then stakeholders, and including our EU partners. And I'd like to extend my thanks to, obviously, Climate-KIC team for pulling this together, both at the EIT and the Coast to Coast team here at OPR for setting this webinar. It is an important engagement as part of our, Coast to Coast work. And I especially would like to thank Peter van Deventer of my staff, who is spearheading our Coast to Coast initiative, both on behalf of California and the EU. As you know, California has been a leader in tackling climate change, and it's continuing that commitment, ushering in a new era of world-leading climate actions under the current Governor Newsom's leadership. Just last September, most of you know, for example, the governor signed a series of new laws that make up the nation's most aggressive climate measures in history that will help reduce the state's oil use by 91%, cut air pollution by 60%, accelerate the state's transition to clean energy to achieve carbon neutrality no later than 2045, and 90% clean energy by 2035. Past targets that California had put on climate have been met or surpassed over the last 20 years. So what the state has done in this cycle is not only continuing on that commitment, but doubling down on that. And the current commitment is also projected to create 4 million new jobs. And these laws and legislation are also backed by an unprecedented investment of $54 billion climate budget that focuses on equity and economic opportunity. So a lot of the work my office will be doing over the next few years will be helping implement the state's really ambitious climate program, along with partners, obviously within California, cities, regions, but also our, learning from our partners in the EU. The Governor's Office of Planning Research is the key land use planning agency for the state and for the governor that is tasked with policy guidance and program implementation that are related to climate risk and resilience, high road economic development, and long-term research and land use planning. So our coast-to-coast effort is an important initiative that fits within that context. And this helps us to bring California and the EU closer together to work and exchange on research and these interrelated global issues. In partnership with the EU, our EU counterpart, Climate-KIC, Coast to Coast is also responsible for the execution of the Memorandum of Understanding that we signed in 2021 at COP26 in Glasgow. It is important to have this partnership, I think, especially with cities. I come from leading cities around land use planning, climate issues, and there is no more important place than cities and regions who actually implement these policies and laws that come from the state or federal government and to achieve sort of a more ambitious and rapid decarbonization goals. And it is critical that we work as a state with local jurisdictions in cities and regions to realize that goal. Currently, the state is supporting, and my office is supporting, the cities and regions and various interrelated programs around climate and land use policies and programs, including the recently established Community Economic Resilience Fund. This is a $600 million fund that is really looking at supporting innovative plans and strategies to diversify local economies and help regions evolve out of fossil fuel economy and develop sustainable industries and create good paying jobs as part of that transition. And that work and that scale of transformation is needed, but it requires significant increase and ambition and commitment at all levels of government and private sector and industries. The scale of that transformation cannot be achieved by government policies alone, obviously, and innovation is an important part of that, as the economic structure and the lessons from climate change, even from COVID, are informing us in how we think about how we use our land, how we use our roads, and how we have to be cognizant of climate change. In my experience and knowledge of cities, the most transformative changes of major cities around the world throughout history have come about because of the significant challenges or disasters from flood, fire, and even COVID now. So this is an incredible opportunity to really rethink how we think about the planet, but more importantly, how we use our local resources so that we hope avert this existential threat from climate change. In addition to our efforts here, similar efforts are underway, of course, in Europe, and Europe has been leading in most of these this space, where highly ambitious new strategies are being developed to help cities with these actions. The state has invited Climate-KIC, the European Climate Innovation, and EIT, Climate-KIC and EIT to speak about the EU's cities mission, which is aiming to help over 100 cities across the continent achieve net zero by 2030, and is already underway. And this is a highly ambitious program, and we felt this might be provide inspiration for discussion this morning and this evening in some places. They're also going to speak about very specific areas of intervention, such as European Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans, or what's known as SUMPs, that cities are pioneering, which may be relevant in high priority areas within our own cities here. So I look forward to this very important webinar, and particularly to the collaboration of regions and cities and partners across the state and across the EU. thank you again for participating this morning.
Thank you for your words, Sam, and also thank you very much for your leadership and service. So next, I'd like to introduce Thomas Osdoba, Director of NetZeroCities EU and Senior Advisor Cities at EIT Climate-KIC. Thomas is a social entrepreneur with a legacy of building and managing organizations and communities. Thomas was the Sustainable Economic Development Manager for Portland, where he created a strategic framework and business development strategies for sustainable regional economy. And Thomas is joining us from Madrid today. So please give us your opening remarks, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Prisan, and thanks, Sam, for your opening remarks. It's very, very good way to begin this conversation. And I wanted to just share a few thoughts with you, at a very high level, about the mission and how it's come about, and Europe's ambition around that, and the importance of this collaboration. And I send apologies from our CEO, Kirsten Dunlap, who met with I think some of you a few months back when she was in California with Neil, but unfortunately is ill. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to set the stage, and then I'm sure we'll get into more detail as we go forward. Maybe just to begin, I'll start from the beginning, and the idea of a mission, which is really grounded in a moonshot logic of a sustained decade-long investment in innovation, learning, and development of institutional capacity to do something that is a societal imperative and is extremely difficult. It's something that we can identify as an objective, but we have not necessarily mapped out how to achieve that objective. So investing in innovation and learning is a central component of this process. And the idea is really well documented in a book by Mariana Mazzucato, whom many of you may have heard of and have already aware of the book around mission innovation and the idea around it as a driver. Now, Climate-KIC, which is really operating on behalf of the European Commission as its sort of driver of innovation in climate activity, has really galvanized a large group of organizations from universities, research institutions, business, nonprofit, and city network organizations to put together NetZeroCities in response to the European Commission's call to create a mission for climate neutral and smart cities by 2030. And earlier this year, we solicited cities who were interested in being a part of that process. And and the goal was to identify 100. And I'm happy to report that the cities really signaled an interest and a commitment to try to do this, noting how extraordinarily challenging it would be. We had almost 400 cities representing nearly 20% of the European population submit expressions of interest and a willingness to commit to this process. Ultimately, the Commission selected 112 cities to work towards climate neutrality by 2030. And we've been working with them now for about the past 6 months to begin this process. We know that in order to help cities with this goal, several things are necessary. One is we need to bring the capabilities, resources, and partnership to cities to invest in and learn through innovation in several areas. And it needs to be done simultaneously. It can't be a matter of picking one area and innovate in that. We have to innovate in citizen engagement, democratic decision-making, governance structures, how we set up business models and deploy projects and capital to shape markets more effectively for climate neutral outcomes, to the capital innovation that would be necessary to align private investment and public capital to deliver on the capital requirements. It's very exciting to hear some of the things California is doing, as well as invest in social innovation to help individuals and organizations adjust and adapt and learn about how to work in support of climate neutral outcomes. I think we're also keenly aware that investing in climate neutrality without paying attention to bigger imperatives around resilience and adaptation need to be factored in at the same time. So this is a big all-encompassing thing, and it requires cities to have a lot of support in capacity, capability development, both inside city government and building ecosystems around them, and then mobilizing resources and capital to make those investments at scale. The last thing I want to say, really just speaking about the relationship and the partnership with California. I'm an American. I'm originally from Minnesota. I've worked with cities across the United States. I've has spent quite a bit of time in City Hall in Los Angeles and San Francisco over the years. And so I'm delighted to be able to have conversations like this from the other side of the ocean, where we can build relationships and partnership. I often say, and Neil and Charlie can echo this, I often say that one of the things that happens in the United States that's a little different than in Europe is there's a lot more aggressive embrace of innovation and a lot more entrepreneurship inside institutions, or intrapreneurship. And that's not to make a comparison, but rather to point out how important it is that we work together. Europe brings policy leadership that in the United States, I think you'd all be happy for. And the United States brings certain things that I think people in Europe would be happy for. And if we bring those things together in a really thoughtful and effective way, I think it's going to benefit us all. I know we're going to get into a lot more detail here, so I'll stop and I'll allow us to get into the conversation. But thanks again for joining us and for the partnership, and we'll look forward to this.
Thank you, Thomas, for your words, and also thank you for spending your evening with us. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce Jay Ziegler, Vice Chair of the California Foundation on the Environment and Economy. He is also the Director of External Affairs and Policy of the Nature Conservancy. He has also served in communications and policy development roles in state and federal government, including with Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt. Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to follow Sam and Thomas here. I'm going to start talking a little bit about the California Foundation on the Environment and the Economy. This is a nonprofit policy and educational foundation dedicated to solving California's most pressing problems. And obviously climate change is fundamental and at the top of that list. CFEE works really as a convener of interests across the spectrum. So from business sector, labor, cities, local governments, more holistically, and in California, we are shaped as counties, 56 counties across the state, housing advocates, and of course the environmental sector in the non-governmental realm. So we're a very diverse group. We convene leaders, state policymakers, leaders in the Newsom administration and others to address complex policy issues. And so in that context, and I'm serving as the vice chair of CFEE, and I'm also representing the NGO sector in CFEE. And so I think Sam gave a really great framework on the work that California is doing. I mean, fundamentally, just over the horizon, we are aiming to reduce our greenhouse gas levels 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And as Sam noted, the state has just put forward a historic investment package of more than $50 billion to address these challenges. In that context, the state's goals, I think, are also very compatible with cities and the member states of the European Union, and thinking of first, how do we address climate change more equitably, as Sam very thoughtfully outlined, and how do we address the social divide and the growing income inequality that we see in the state in the context of a climate response strategy. Second, overall, how do we build stronger economies in response to a climate changing world? What's that look like? And finally, how do we make our cities, municipalities, and the landscapes of California more sustainable as a fabric in where we live and work. And I'm going to spend just a minute thinking about that in the context of the work at the Nature Conservancy, because I think fundamentally what I'm interested in hearing from you all about is how do we bridge the strategies that we can sometimes think of as urban and leading in addressing heat island effect, in reducing vehicle miles traveled, in providing smarter, climate smart buildings and houses, and then recognizing that we can't just address this problem as an urban problem. This is a fundamentally a global issue that we need regional strategies to respond to, and we can't do this only in the urban landscape. That we have to get the urban communities invested in the ex-urban solution set, and the importance of that, I think, is underscored by the fact that in California, as many of you are aware, we've had Assembly Bill 32 on the books for almost approaching 20 years now. And in just one summer, in 2019, a horrific mega fire season that burned several million acres of our forest lands erased all of the gains in technological investments to address climate change. So I think I use that point to really underscore that we have to think about the natural world. And as Thomas underscored, we need to think about adaptation and resilience strategies in this context, and that there's no silver bullet, I think, but I want to make a strong pitch that one of the things that we're really wrestling with CFEE, and again, this organization, the California Foundation on the Environment and the Economy, involves groups including the oil industry companies, energy companies, utilities, local governments, and then environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy, Natural Resources Defense Council. So the full spectrum of interests involved in climate change and how we advance this work, and how we do it in a way that is responsive to the economic challenges around us as well. How do we build consensus for action? How do we build consensus beyond our borders? How do we get cities interested in the ex-urban environment, and build the right kinds of incentives to protect our forests and wetlands and our carbon sinks as part of the strategy? And so I think fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to really wrestle with what is the practical framework for action to really accelerate our climate goals, because I think all of us are experiencing this increasing threat and reality and immediate challenges from climate change. In California, we're celebrating rain today because we are in the throes of a 20-year drought and a real aridification problem across the southwestern United States, that it will fundamentally change agriculture, our economies, and our cities. And so I think these challenges are huge. We really, we at the Nature Conservancy and at the California Foundation for the Environment and the Economy really recognize the need to have multifaceted solution sets that encompass land use planning. And I really want to kind of tip my cap to Sam for the work he is doing at the Office of Planning and Research for the governor, really trying to integrate smart climate planning across multiple values. And I think that that's the essence of responding to this climate challenge. So I thank you all for this conversation today, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jay, also for your advocacy work in our state. All right, so the next two speakers will give us a brief overview of the European Net Zero Cities program and Europe's Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, or SUMP. We first have Thomas Haddock, Program Manager for Net Zero Cities at EIT Climate-KIC. Tom joined Climate-KIC in January 2022, where he took on the role of Program Manager for Net Zero Cities, supporting the delivery of the Climate Neutral and Smart Cities mission. Prior to this role, Tom worked as a principal transport consultant at WSP, an engineering consultancy, where he worked on strategy and infrastructure projects in the Future Mobility team. Tom draws upon his experience from across the public, private, and third sector to support the 112 climate neutral and smart mission cities and progress the development of the Net Zero Cities program. Following Tom, we have Charlotte May, Cities Advisor at EIT Climate-KIC. And Charlotte has a background in sustainable transport planning, environmental management, and health policy. Charlotte has worked with and for cities in the UK, Germany, and Spain. So thank you, Tom and Charlotte. So I'll turn it over to Tom.
Great. Let me just share my screen quickly. Okay. Great. Hopefully you can all see that now. No?
Not yet, no.
Okay, let me try again. Okay.
Yes, we can now.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today, and following on from 3 fantastic introductory talks. And it's a real privilege to be here and share with you today a little bit about NetZeroCities and the EU Cities mission. I would start off by saying that I think it's probably good to clarify NetZeroCities and the difference between NetZeroCities and the EU Cities mission, in that at NetZeroCities, we are coordinating on behalf of the European Commission the climate neutral and smart cities mission, and that's how the two interrelate. We're the platform manager, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means. But as Thomas Osdoba introduced already in his talk, is that we are supporting the EU mission's climate neutral and smart cities, and this is 100 climate neutral and smart cities across Europe and associated countries, and you can see the spread there on the right. And the objectives of the city are 100 climate neutral and smart cities, and NetZeroCities is the platform to support the mission. So what are our key mission objectives? So first of all, to develop an approach to support climate neutral transformation cities, to forge a platform with services and expertise, and this is one of the key areas that NetZeroCities is delivering on, alongside the systemic change needed for using innovation, and then to create a pipeline for cities accelerating towards climate neutrality. This is those cities that we're bringing along with the mission cities. So, and NetZeroCities itself is a consortium. So Climate-KIC, we are the coordinator, the lead organization in this consortium, but we have 32 other organizations that we work with. And the reason we have such a large consortium is the complexity of the challenge at hand and the different subject areas that we needed to have support in. So within our consortium, we've got a variety of different organizations. We have some city networks, those organizations who have pre-established networks among cities across Europe. We have universities, and then we also have specialist organizations who focus on areas such as systems innovation or financial innovation and investment. And what are we working on as a consortium? So as you can imagine, the enormity of the task at hand and the challenges we face, are extremely complex, and the support offer that we are trying to build has to match the needs of the cities and the challenges that they're going to face. And we can split this. We can relatively easily split this into 3 key areas that NetZeroCities is working on, and this is the mission platform. And the mission platform is essentially the delivery arm of the mission, as I mentioned, and it focuses on 3 key outputs. One is the mission portal. This is the digital space, which is facilitating our interactions. I'll go into more detail on all of these in a second. The next phase is the city advisors, and they are the human element of this mission platform. They're the key conduit between relationships of the cities and the consortium. And then we have our service design team, which is a large group of specialists from across the consortium who can be brought in at any one time to provide expert advice to the cities. Then we have the NetZeroCities pilots, and this is a sub-grant or cascade grant scheme where we will work with 30 cities much more closely and provide funding to support some of the front-runner cities to deliver some systemic projects over a 2-year period. And then finally, we have our climate neutral city contracts. And these are the main sort of tool or lever in which we can focus the mission around, that's bringing together the strategy in action plan and investment plan of how each city is going to deliver on this mission. So just to give you an overview of how this all fits together, you can see here the key areas we talked about in the slide before. So we've got in yellow, the Climate City contracts, we've got in green mission platform, and then in blue at the top right, we've got the pilots and the twinning program, which I'll come on to in a second. And then in light green along the bottom, we've got the service design support teams who are feeding into that mission platform, feeding into those city advisors. So I won't go into too much more detail here, but this is just to give you an idea of how all of these various moving parts of the program fit together and work together and hopefully complement each other. So the mission portal, the one-stop online portal. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on this side here, because this feeds back to what I was saying in one of the earlier slides, in that we do have different service levels of cities we want to support. We have our core mission cities of 112, but as Thomas mentioned at the start, we had significantly more apply, and we don't want to leave those cities behind. And we want to do what we can to bring them along on the journey. So the city's mission is by no means a closed shop. There's obviously more support available to mission cities, but we're trying to ensure that there's significant resources available to any city. And we hope going forward in the future, we'll be able to support second wave cities. This just shows you on the right the different level of access that different users have to the portal. And I would just note, we can see here that any cities have access to some of the key parts of this portal, including our knowledge repository, which is our key resource of our key set of resources produced by NetZeroCities, but also from externally as well. We also have the P2P collaborative space, which any city can be a part of and share learnings and insights. And we also have the city dashboard, which is where we'll be monitoring progress of cities that can be accessed as well. Then alongside that, we have the city advisors, who are the human face of the process, and they are critical to the success of NetZeroCities, enabling to support the cities on their mission. We have 12 city advisors, and we're hoping that we're going to be getting more down the line. And these are all extremely experienced individuals who, on the whole, have spent time working within a city administration. And since we've had all the city advisors on board, which is about September, we've seen such a significant increase in our ability to work with the cities, communicate, and also the cities have expressed their appreciation and how much easier it is now. We have the city advisors in place to understand what's the complexity of the services we're providing and to sort of wade through that complexity. So I just put a few bullet points here, because at the moment our city advisors are going through a support needs assessment process with each city. Each city is allocated one city advisors, and the city advisors support them in groups. But this initial process, understanding where the cities are, what their biggest challenges they're facing, and how best we can provide tailored support for each individual city. So now I'm going to move on to the pilots, the second of the three key areas. And as I said, this is a cascade grant where we have received funds from Horizon 20, and we're cascading that down to cities through 32 million for approximately 30 grants. Now, the window for these pilots just closed. But I think that the key thing to say is that these projects are not a significant value. They range from $500,000 to 1.5 million, depending on the application. And the way that we've steered the application process is that we are not providing funding necessarily for delivering big infrastructure projects or whatever it might be, that the multi-million-pound projects that will need to be delivered as part of this transition. What we want to fund is more focus on understanding the system that you're working in, understanding regulatory barriers, policy barriers, building capability and capacity needed. And so it's really using that pot of funding to make sure that we can understand the challenge, understand the barriers, to be prepared to deliver the large infrastructure projects we're going to need as we move through the next 7 years. But what I would say here is, interestingly, we've seen within these applications is we did allow cities to apply in groups or in sort of consortium, and we've seen a significant interest in cities wanting to apply together. So we can't share any details because we're still processing them, but there's groups of cities in multiple countries across the EU who have applied together, and they want to share the the grant and work collaboratively on a project. And we're seeing this more and more outside of just the pilots as well, just in general with the mission, is that we're seeing cities wanting to collaborate more than compete, more often than not. And we're starting to see the formation of a lot of city networks or national networks or national platforms where cities are coming together to form around a national platform, to share learnings, to share experiences, to work together and put leverage at ultimately at the national level to align with their ambition. And so to the Climate City contracts, and this is one of the core levers of change that we are asking the cities to work with us on. And it consists of three main parts. It consists of the commitments, the action plan, and the investment plan. Now, all of these three parts need to interact, and we'll come on to each part in a little bit, particularly the action plans and investment plans. But ultimately, the aim of this Climate City contract is to create a realistic set of actions with a realistic investment plan to pull together the capital needed, and then with an overarching commitment with key signatories who have signed up to the strategy. And all of these three core parts become the Climate City contract. Now, each city will have various options about twice a year to submit their Climate City contract to the European Commission. The European Commission will be doing a review process to check the strategies, and if successful, the cities will receive the mission label. And the mission label is there to provide certainty around what's being proposed as being a realistic and deliverable. And it provides two main benefits. One is some security to private investors. And the second is advantageous position in other pots of funding within the European Commission. So just to say how this fits into, so the climate transition map is one of the key tools that we have developed in consultation with the cities and how to map the process. And I'm not going to go into too much detail now here because we're short of time, but I just wanted to show you how the Climate City contracts, the action plans, investment plans sit into the overall iterative journey that we are hoping to go on the cities with. And the action plans, investment plans, they really sit in these first three steps, which are building a strong mandate, understanding the system, co-creating a portfolio. Now, the different cities are at different stages in this process. Some are already at the co-creating profile stage before they even apply to join the mission, some of the front runners. Others are still very much trying to build that mandate within their city to really engage on this mission. And once you get through this co-creating portfolio portfolio stage, you should be at the position where your strategy is in place, and then it's a case of enacting that strategy. But we see this as iterative and continuous, and we know that some cities' action plans and investment plans may not be as ambitious as they first need to be, but the whole goal of this process is that at each time we revisit it, it gets stronger and stronger. Plans. So action plans, not necessarily something new. Lots of cities already have in place strategies and action plans, and for example, some sustainable urban mobility plans, which my colleague Charlotte will touch upon. And we see all of these things being able to feed into the action plan. We have created a template and some guidance to support cities in developing the action plan, but we're aware that there's already a lot of strategy out there, and we're not saying that we're asking is not to a 2030 target. So it's taking what they've got in their core strategy and then increasing the ambition to that 2030 target. So we do encourage cities to include what they currently have, but for most cities, if not all, there will need to be some increase in ambition. And I'll just move on. So I'm not going to talk too much on this right now, but this is a key part of the action plan, which is once you've developed the action and once the strategy has been, the strategy document has been complete, is that part of that is then what's the next step? How do we then get to the what we call the theory of change, or to take you on those impact pathways to actually get the impacts and co-benefits that you need from each of the interventions that you propose. And this just gives an example of a 15-minute city, 15-minute neighborhood, just because we're going to be focusing on transport in the next part of the transport mobility in the next part of the presentation. And I'm sure all of you are aware of this already, but 15-minute city is where your goods and services are within 15 minutes of cycling and walking. And in this diagram here, you can see how it falls within the mobility and transport. We've got to identify what our mission domains are around that. Then we've got to look at the interventions that will impact the ability to deliver a 15-minute city. So, for example, we know we're going to need capital for infrastructure development, which is finance and funding, but without the accompanying behavior and lifestyle changes, social innovation, then we won't get anywhere. So it's identifying the intervention, it's identifying the selected lever, and it's creating a portfolio of actions to deliver on that change. That then should take you to the direct impacts and co-benefits. In my experience of working in transport, nobody, apart from people heavily invested, care about the direct impacts, but everyone seems to care a lot more about the co-benefits. So air quality, flood risk reduction, urban greening is a much easier sell in a public consultation than saying car traffic will reduce. But ultimately, the direct impacts are going to be the important impacts for the 2030 target and how we monitor and evaluate that target. So then onto the third part of the CCC, what is an investment plan? So this is the slightly more innovative new element that we are working with cities around, and it's starting to try and think of the role of how cities play in funding infrastructure. So a key few differences in the way that cities in the EU currently operate is that we are looking at citywide approach to investment. We're looking again at that iterative process. We're looking at acting as a catalyst. The investment plan acts as a catalyst to optimize capital and help cities seek more funding and finance. And the acting as a catalyst element is probably the most difficult one that we are for cities to embrace at the moment, because it's so far off their normal processes around finance, and it requires the ability to accept more risk than they're used to. And what it's really saying is that, so we worked with an organization called Material Economics in the consortium, and they did a piece of work where they looked at how much would it cost a city of 100,000 people to become climate neutral by 2030. Now they calculated that at roughly 1 billion euros, of which they calculated on average a city would have around a third of that from its current funds, from its current capital, and therefore the other two remaining thirds would have to come from other elsewhere, much of which is private investment or things like green bonds. So having this long-term thinking about finance more than just a couple of years and embracing a slightly more risk is a calculated risk, I would say, is a core part of the investment plan. But it's going to be definitely one of the hardest things for the cities to deliver on and deliver on it successfully. And I don't think anyone knows yet with either the action plan or the investment plan what the perfect solution is. So there is going to be a lot of learning and a lot of learning together as we learn as a consortium and the cities, and we learn from each other with the cities. And then finally, just how the action plan interacts with the investment plan is that, simplistically, we need action that delivers impact. There's the costs are going to be required to meet the actions, and then the capital required to meet the costs, all working in harmony together in theory. I think, then this just touched on, I think I've touched on some of these already, but what the financial challenge is, it's incredibly hard to, even when you can get the innovation in place, it's very hard to implement new technology at scale. I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges to connect that ability to innovate and create novel solutions to then actually implementing and scaling them. The urgency, 2030 is not far away at all. So these things need to happen fast, and cities and ourselves need to move much quicker than we have been used to doing in the past. The complexity, it is a complex environment out there. We know local authorities and cities have competing competing options of where funding might go, and in some instances we're working with cities where the transition team or the climate change team or whatever they want to call it is 1 or 2 people. So navigating that complexity, not only in the challenge of climate neutrality, but also in the complexity of the systems in which people are operating in, is a big part around the challenges. And then creating a just transition where the levelling up agenda promotes equality and the policies and financing around that are adequate. So I think that brings me, this is the last page of my presentation, and I think it's just a sort of, just to see everything in one picture. We can see we've got how there's various interactions of the Net Zero City portal, building a transition team to help deliver on the change within cities, the climate neutral city contract, and then ultimately on the road to change, which is through the climate transition map, support from the city advisors, and funding from the pilots. And I didn't actually touch on twinning in this presentation at the end, but another key part of the pilots is that each pilot will have a number of twins that they'll work with to share learnings. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. It was a very sort of quick overview of operationally how we are trying to deliver this and how we're trying to work with our partners in the consortium and with the cities. But happy to share some more takeaways in the Q&A section. So thank you, and I'll pass over to my colleague, Charlotte. Oh, can't hear you, Charlotte.
Better? Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't have control of the slides, so each time I'd like you to move on, I'll just say next slide if that's okay. Great, so I'm here to talk about sustainable urban mobility plans, or as we in UK English call them, transport plans, but mobility is the term that's generally used across the EU. Next slide, please, Thomas. Yeah, just to say that in the EU, transport is the problem sector, and I've sort of ringed it in red, so you can see that other sectors are reducing steadily, but transport's proving particularly difficult, even though COVID did cause a dip in transport emissions, but those have already rebounded quite quickly, and the steady increase looks set to carry on. So next slide, please. Yeah, so just a bit more context. Transport accounts for about 25% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. It's rebounded after COVID, as was expected, and the European Union has recently launched a new, more ambitious mobility framework, partly incorporating some of the lessons learned during the pandemic. The key aspects of the new urban mobility framework are a much more ambitious approach to urban transport planning, and also a much more integrative approach. So rather than looking at transport as a sort of sector, as an isolated sector, making sure that it integrates with in a systemic way, in the way that we've just been talking about in the context of net zero cities. So the new framework has a strong focus on walking, cycling, and public transport, and zero emission urban logistics. And just there's some photos to show how that's translating into action on the ground. So I'm based in Valencia, Spain, and one of the big projects that was worked on during COVID as part of their transport strategy, their SUMP, and within the framework of the European Mobility Framework. This is their transformation of a local square, the before and after pictures. Next slide, please. Yeah, just here's the accepted definition of a plan. So it's called different things in different countries across the EU, depending on what is a useful title for it in order for it to fit in with other planning strategies. But SUMP is widely recognised across the EU, and just as Thomas pointed out with the climate city contracts and the action planning and investment planning, the idea is to build on existing planning and strategies, and to integrate those. And there's a strong focus as well on participation with citizens and stakeholders, really important in transport, as any of you who've worked in that sphere will know, and also a much more of a focus on evaluation, which has tended to be neglected in much urban mobility planning. Next slide, please. To complement SUMPs, there's what's called SULPs. Now, they're basically sustainable urban logistic plans. So they are, the European Union strongly encourages cities to develop these together. So separately, but together, and to integrate them. And then the SUMPs and the SULPs in their turn are linked into sustainable energy and climate action plans, and within the mission cities, and we hope all European cities in future, into all of the documents and strategies that Thomas has just outlined in his presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, SUMPs, as I say, they're flexible. They're designed to be flexible tools. They're not rigid templates. There are plenty of templates and guidance documents out there, and I'll put some. Well, I've put some links in this presentation. I'll also put one in the chat afterwards, a really useful link to a vast amount of information on these. But the key, I suppose, a key difference between SUMPs and conventional transport planning is that rather than just looking at the administrative boundary, you're looking at the functional the functional urban area. So including all of the commuting in and out and the logistics in and out of the city as well. Another key aspect of SUMPs as opposed to conventional planning is cooperating across institutional and sectoral boundaries. So, for example, when I was developing a SUMP in a city in my transport planning past, we're working very closely with public health, with economic regeneration, yes, with the climate team, but also with the sports teams and the education teams as well, to make sure that we were finding synergies and ironing out any conflicts. Participation we've already talked about, assessing current and future performance, making sure that that you're baselining and considering a range of future scenarios, and this is key really as well, developing. There's often been a focus in conventional transport planning on traffic and motor vehicles, and key in SUMP planning is to look at modes together, and yeah, active, with a strong focus on active travel and public transport. Yeah, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Again, this is just a list of the contrasting conventional transport planning and the SUMP approach. I think I've mentioned most of those, but yeah, the very much focus on people. Traffic engineers will of course be highly involved in the process, but in the past they would have driven it perhaps without the input of interdisciplinary teams, and now the focus is very much on pulling in those interdisciplinary teams and complementing expert advice with a transparent and participatory approach. Yeah, we could go to the next slide. Thank you. And then you'll see a wheel here, very similar to the the wheel that Thomas showed us in the context of NetZeroCities. This is just a sort of systematic diagram showing how you can work through the steps to building up your sustainable urban mobility program plan. And if you could jump to the next one, Thomas. Yep, here we've got some, I've just listed here because I knew we'd be short of time, but I've listed some good SUMPs. Now, a lot of, because, you know, there's a wide range of languages in the EU. So the European Mobility Observatory, ELTIS, has helpfully summarized some of these, some of the best sustainable urban mobility plans, and you can find links to some of those here. But if you speak Spanish or German, you have access to a wider range, and in the cities themselves. If you could carry on, Thomas. Thank you. Here are the links. So I've linked to a lot of to a range of sumps here, but I would encourage you, if you are interested, to have a look at the ELTIS Urban Mobility Observatory. Not only did they provide examples, but there's templates, there's a huge array of guidance there, and I'm very happy to take any questions afterwards as well. So I'm sorry I've run through that very quickly, but happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, both Tom and Charlotte, for, well, you're both based in Europe, so thank you for joining us during your evening hours to share your insights. We will now have our Q&A. This will be moderated by Peter van Deventer, Peter, Director of the Coast to Coast Smart E-Mobility Program at OPR, where he connects governments, industry, and academia on smart and clean transportation solutions. Before joining OPR in 2013, Peter worked in the Netherlands and Africa, where he was responsible for transportation and land use departments, both within local and regional governments, as well as within consultancy. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Puissant, and thank you, Thomas and Charlotte. Great summary of all this exciting stuff that's going on. And I really have a ton of questions, but I've also seen a lot of questions come about in the chat. So rather than me asking all the questions, I think it's better we just address those questions that came about. And I know, Neil, you've been keeping track of the questions that were posed during the presentation. Which question sort of stands out for you that we could have on the table here?
Sure. Well, looking at them, I mean, there are several asking for more details about the program. And so just quickly, not just on this program, but on the urban mobility plans and others. On that, rather than getting into too much detail about those specifically, what we'll do is after this workshop, and we'll share the recording of this webinar, and we'll also put our contact details in, and we can follow up directly with people if they want to get connections to sustainable urban mobility plans and so forth. That's not a problem. I think perhaps if we work backwards to some extent, the first question I'd like to ask is, so from Christina, about curious where in the US NetZero's is operating or hoping to operate. So I'll answer that one quickly and then hand over to others. At the moment, NetZeroCities is only operating in Europe and some association countries. And association countries means countries like Israel and the UK, because the UK isn't part of Europe anymore, unfortunately. And so it isn't technically operating in the US at the moment. That being said, the European Union is very keen to work closely with the United States to join forces around helping cities to become rapidly more sustainable with this level of ambition. Now, at the moment, we've been engaging with Peter and others with the state of California for looking at how Californian cities in particular could potentially connect with this program in different shapes and forms. And this is part of the reason we're here, is to perhaps have some ideas around that. But I would say as well, there is growing interest from other parts of the US in, if not necessarily participating in the program directly or replicating it, but at least learning from it and seeing where there's connections. And I think one of the key things is that there is potentially the opportunity for direct twinning of cities in the US with those in the NetZeroCities program in Europe, for there to be a shared learning there. At the moment, everything is on the table, and this is where, if there is an interest in enthusiasm for that, for people to come forward and say it, because then we can actually start to come up with some ideas for what that might look like. So that would be my immediate response. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that comment, and then we'll move through some of the other questions. Yeah. So I think then maybe the next one would be, do you see a role for regional governments in the NetZeroCities program? I would say yes, absolutely. And I think this is And actually, no, Thomas, maybe best if you comment on this, as you're more involved in that side of things. Over to you, Thomas.
Sure, no problem. Yes, so I mean, multi-level governance is undoubtedly a key part of all of this, and cities cannot do it alone. We know that already. As the region or national level can't do it without the cities or without each other as well. So there's definitely a role for regional government, and we are facilitating those relationships as far as possible. I would say there's another mission called the Adaptation Mission, which is one of the 5 key missions alongside the Climate Neutral and Smart Cities mission, and they do have a key focus on working with the regional level. So we're at the moment very much working with them to create those synergies and links and partnerships to help us complement the 2 missions, and to make sure that we can, as far as possible, make sure we've got the cities, the regions, and the national level all in dialogue together.
Excellent. And Neil, I think you've sort of taken over my role. That's all fine. I think it's excellent. So I think, the one question that, before, I think we should open the floor for any questions that you have that you did not post in the chat. So I think it's a question actually both to Thomas and to Charlotte. California is always about innovation, right? So, and I've learned that innovation typically takes place if you start to learn from things you would have liked to done differently. And then it sort of becomes interesting for those who are applying the system, because then you ask others who are relatively new to come up with innovation. So maybe more like, a question that I find very interesting to have at least a discussion on. Thomas, you just started, but Charlotte, you've been in this for a long time, or much longer. What sort of what would be your recommendations to for California to maybe have a crack at some of the innovations that you see needed in these 2 approaches?
Well, if we're going to go back to transport, I would say probably all of us here know how difficult it is to make the necessary changes in transport, particularly when it comes to limiting the use of motor vehicles. So I think one of the innovations that I've learned from and continue to learn is how we can get more politicians and citizens on board for and aware of the huge quality of life, health, environmental, and aesthetic benefits of reducing the dominance of the car in cities and also in the peripheries of cities. And I think, so I know we're not talking sort of techno innovations here, but I think some of the cities that I'm most impressed by here in Europe are the ones that are really going for it and realizing the benefits, keeping their head down when it's difficult. Well, sorry, keeping going when it's difficult, and coming out the other side, and their citizens really appreciating how their cities have changed for the better. And one of those cities, for example, is where I'm based in Valencia, and some of the pictures in my presentation were from there. Yeah.
You've just given us, I think, the most complicated innovation assignment that I can think of, because the US, and I've been here for a while, we're very car centric. So it's very difficult to, but as I said, we love challenges as well. And so I'm gonna write that down as one of the innovations, to even go further in making the cities less car centric. I think it'd be an amazing accomplishment if we can pull that off in the US. I've seen some examples during COVID, and we've seen some cities change a bit and keep, in the ordinances have new measures to keep the cars out, but it's going to be for sure a challenge. So before I hand over to thank you, Charlotte. And before I hand it over to back to the audience, I have sort of same question to you, Thomas. So you've designed or helped to set this up, this NetZeroCities approach, and there are these connections, such as with the sustainable urban mobility plans and others. If you were to do things differently in your setup, what would be your advice? to us here in California?
Yeah. So if we were to do things differently in NetZeroCities, I think some of the lessons we've learned so far is that I think I touched on this in my presentation, but how critical the city advisors have been in this process. And for various reasons, we didn't have them programmed in to start as early as they perhaps should have done. So I think making sure we've got those experienced individuals in place as soon as possible to act as the conduit between the organizations involved in facilitating it and the cities, I think that's critical. I would also say that working in a large consortium has been great for the levels of experience, but it's also then making sure, how do you bring out the best of each organization, and how do you focus, bring in the skills and experience that each consortium has. And we have now got to a position where we're working very well together as a consortium, and we have done for a number of months. But I think one of the things that we did at the very start, this is actually before I joined, is we did a one-day kickoff with the consortium. My advice would be, if you're working in a large complex group, do a 5-day kickoff where you can spend a lot of time working together, getting to know yourselves, getting to know the different organizations, the different skill sets in those organizations. And I think, just to touch on the prior question quickly as well, in terms of how do we innovate? How do we innovate to work on the challenges? I think you've got to think about the innovation landscape say you're trying to tackle one problem. First of all, it's understanding what that problem actually is and what the pain points are in delivering that problem. But it's then delivering innovation at different levels. And that comes a little bit back to the kind of theory of change we looked at in the graph. It's like, at the same time as we're going to need technological innovation to move away from a card-centric, we're going to need governance innovation as well. We're going to need social innovation. So we need all these different layers of innovation to ultimately make the changes.
Well, I'm both of you, and thank you, Thomas. Very impressive answers, and I think it just adds to why I think here at the governor's office we wanted to have this conversation. I think there's so much we can learn. We're on this road together, and we see many of the things that are needed worldwide, and you're already able to reflect on some of what the lessons that you've learned. Please keep on sharing them with us. I think that would be great. So thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Charlotte. And maybe I want to open the floor for the audience to ask any question that you feel has not been answered. You can do that by raising your hand or opening up your mic, and I'll try to see if I can make sure you are visible to everyone. Please go ahead. Yes, Carol Lee, please go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Cara Lee Brown, and I'm the Assistant Executive Director at the Institute for Local Government. We're actually the nonprofit affiliate of the League of California Cities, California State Association of Counties, and California Special Districts. And we actually have two programs that are kind of similar to your program, Thomas, that you talked about. One is our Beacon program. It's been around for 10 years when really local governments weren't totally on board with climate change and that it was man-made and that there's something they can do with it. So we since then have 170 cities, counties, and special districts that have passed resolutions saying that they will work towards addressing climate and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we do that in a couple different ways. One is by offering an awards program, but also what we feel the real meat of the program is in that best practice sharing. And so we are in the currently updating our sustainability best practices, where we kind of take all the best practices in water, land use, all these 10 different categories that local governments have actually done, not kind of pie in the sky ideas, but really what local governments have done. And then we share them. We kind of ask folks annually to report to us what they've done, and then we are going to share those back out to them. So I really acknowledge that peer-to-peer networking and sharing is really a way to spur innovation. The second program, and I'm sad that Sam left, is our Boost program, and it was a pilot program that we started with the Strategic Growth Council. We got some money from the legislature to pilot, and it's really more what you're doing is really that hands-on technical assistance and capacity building for local governments. We're currently working with 7 local governments right now, and they're really more the rural, small, disadvantaged communities. And it's great because they just don't have the money. They just don't have the capacity or staff to address climate at all. They're really just trying to fill potholes and do the basics. And so we've been able to put, climate mitigation and adaptation back on their plates so they can think about it. I have to give props to the state of California for all the innovative funding pots that they've have and how they're prioritizing these disadvantaged communities, because that's really made a true difference. We have cities like cities of Needles and Barstow and McFarland and Maywood who would never be able to think about this, doing climate action plans, doing local hazard mitigation plans and things that they know they need to do in a while and just haven't had the capacity to do that. So a lot of what we do with the programs, and I know, Charlotte, you've mentioned this throughout your presentation, is really also embedding equity in those. So, we have in the Beacon program, there's folks like Santa Monica, Amanda, who's been working for, 10, 15 years towards climate. And there's folks who are very, very new to it and really understanding the opportunities that exist within their unique communities for mitigation measures as well as adaptation measures has been really interesting to us. And we're able to share those kind of like experiences with other similar local governments throughout California. So really interested in your project, Thomas, and thanks so much. I would love to share kind of war stories with you and talk about how we can learn from each other and really, make these programs more robust and helpful to our governments.
Great. Thank you. Really interesting to hear some of the insight from the work you've been doing. And we can definitely relate to the things you were just talking about there, particularly, the importance of peer-to-peer. This is such a big part of the NetZeroCities program. Particularly through a few different areas, as I talked about with the pilots doing the twinning and making sure that where we're funding a project and working with the city as well. But yes, we can really support those smaller cities that don't have the capacity, and we can provide them with that capacity and resource. Whereas some of the larger cities, they have capacity, they just need perhaps some support on, a guidance, advice, shared learning, etc. So yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
And maybe also some of the smaller cities are more agile. So the bigger cities can also learn from that. So.
Excellent. I think this is already demonstrating to me that it sort of makes sense to have you all in one virtual room to exchange lessons learned and look forward. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Who can I give the microphone? Yes, Christina, please go ahead.
Well, first, thank you. This was, but I'm just curious how that might play out with what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I can give a bit of an overview, but Charlie may want to add it to. But I mean, undoubtedly, engaging communities is critical for any city to get to any climate neutrality at any year, let alone 2030. And we have as part of the service design element of the NetZeroCities is to be able to provide support around community and stakeholder engagement. We have a number of resources to help facilitate that, and our city advisors can also support the cities on that. Some cities are already very good at doing community engagement in the EU, particularly in Scandinavian countries, others less so. So back to the previous point, it's working with the cities to understand where they've got their big challenges, and then we can provide resource, advice, and some support. But then ultimately, we need to especially with the various languages across the EU, is that community engagement has to be done at the local level with the local players. Charlotte, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I'm really sorry, I have to fly, but yes, I would say that there are some very good examples. There are a lot of, certainly in Spanish cities, there's some very good examples of community engagement. But as you say, it does tend to be by the cities themselves. We can advise them and put them in touch with each other to benefit from best practice. But the actual nitty-gritty of the engagement with their own citizens is usually coordinated by the city. So I can only really add that to Thomas. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm really sorry I have to go now, but very happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Charlotte.
you, and lovely to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah, so you know, else I would have a question for some of the cities here on the line. So, you know, basically we're trying to see, you know, and learn from what's happening in Europe. And my question to maybe Amanda, you know, Grossman at the city of Santa Monica. I hope you can hear me. I'm just, you know, I would be interested, you know, like how, you know, what would be, when would this sort of be interesting, this knowledge transfer for your city? Would you be able to share your thoughts with me?
Sure. So I would just say, I mean, we are definitely interested in knowledge sharing. I think we do a lot with that on the regional level as well as the national level through different networks. And then our city also participates in a program through ICLEI we've been partnered with a city, I think it's in Belgium. I forget the exact city. It's my coworker that's doing it, but it's mostly focused on transportation and mobility. And so idea sharing and policy sharing as well.
Excellent. So is there any other, and so when you talk about sharing information, you know, that because it always comes on top of things you need to do anyways. And do you have dedicated people who sort of do this, who reach out to other regions, other cities, including cities maybe across the US or outside the US? How does it work for you?
Yes, it depends on the topic, but typically we have an analyst that's looking at each different topic individually. So if like we have something on electric vehicle charging, we have an analyst that'll reach out to either other cities. We also have a network of it's called Green Cities California, where we kind of share information. And then we have the online forum through the Urban Sustainabilities Directors Network, where we also get information on the national level, just trying to figure out what other cities are doing to address certain topics.
Yeah, I know you're very active in the Green Cities Coalition. So that's that's I think that's wonderful. Thank you. I just wanted to to see some of your response. Any other question that you have? I'm sorry, Charlotte had to go, but maybe a question for Thomas, if there is anyone who has a question for him. If not, I have a question for you, Thomas. So yeah, so about these cities, you said they're trying to collaborate together. So these 112 cities, they have just been announced, and you said they're working together, or they're trying to collaborate together. Is that like in terms of entering a bid together on these individual grants, or is it that they try and see what kind of connects them at the level of the various issues that they are being confronted with? Can you elaborate a little bit more on it? Because that's very interesting, right? That was an unforeseen benefit, I would think, of your program.
I think it was definitely unforeseen to the scale that we've seen it, for sure. Prior to even the expression of interest for the city's mission, there were already some strong national networks, particularly in Scandinavian countries, but elsewhere we've seen them arise organically around the mission, which has been really interesting and really positive. Particularly in Spain, Italy, and Greece, we've seen national platforms form around the mission, and this is for a number of reasons. First of all, in that they want to share their learnings and share the strategies within the cultural environment that they exist, but also it's to acknowledge that there's the systems they operate in are also a barrier, and those systems both internally at the administration, and also frustration at the speed in which the national governments are moving to support them, is that there's more ability to impact these barriers as a group, rather than going one individually trying to resolve them. So I think it's fantastic. We're hoping that with as a future fund, we're going to get some more additional funding down the line, which is going to help us to support the cities in some of the smaller countries to develop these national platforms as well. So we really are going to promote this concept and idea that we should be forming these national platforms.
That's super interesting and very energizing, I would have to say. So please keep us posted on also on this, this organic shaping up of relationships and trying to find. I think that's in the end, that's exciting for everyone. It's exciting for you, I think, as a coordinator and the whole group, but also for these cities individually. Wonderful. Yeah, so we're at the end of the Q&A, and we're about at the end of the of this webinar. But I'd like to give the remainder of the time to Neil. Sorry, Neil, for having to cut you off, because I had asked you to sort of give this, I gave you sort of like an assignment to start asking questions, and then I realized, yeah, so. But thank you for stepping in. Please, can you share your last thoughts with us before we close off the webinar? Thank you.
No problem at all, Peter. No, I thought that was really good, and it was great to hear some of the thoughts and observations and questions. And I believe there's actually I think there's a few slightly technical questions that we didn't quite manage to answer, such as the ICLEI reporting frameworks and so forth. But we can follow up on that via email if that might be easier, just to explain how that works. So it's been really useful to hear this, and I'm particularly excited in getting people's perspectives, because as Thomas has shared, this is quite a significant investment, particularly on part of the European Commission, but on the part of the cities themselves. Cities have been working very hard on this for a number of years, and as people have mentioned, there are a number of networks and programs and initiatives underway to support them in this, but this is really intended to be an additional boost to really help them drive to the next level of ambition above where they're currently at. And it's recognizing the sheer scale of the challenge that it's faced requires simply a step change in approach. And this is really what NetZeroCities is hoping to try and achieve, and the city's mission more generally, building upon a lot of excellent work that's already taking place. And I think one of my questions and to people on this call and to cities in California more widely is whether this approach would potentially add value to what Californian cities are doing as well. In addition to existing initiatives, we wouldn't see this as replacing them or competing with them, but as essentially a kind of an additional level of catalyzing resources and support if it could be created. This is something that on Climate-KIC side we are looking into. We are thinking about supporting cities in the US more broadly on this, and we're having discussions with the federal government around it. But really, California is where we see the most action, and we have for many years. This is one of the reasons Climate-KIC and by extension the European Institute for Innovation and Technology and the Commission has developed such a close relationship with the state and the cities, the agencies and organizations working, is because California does have that level of ambition that really kind of drives the path forward across the United States more generally as well. So it would be great to see if there would be an interest in developing something along these lines, maybe not quite at the same level as the Commission, because that is a big investment, as you can imagine. And what Thomas has described is really just the first stages. This is a 10-year commitment, as mentioned, and there will be additional stages year on year as it expands and grows. But if there is an interest in developing something like this, we may have some options for doing that. So it'd be great to get some ideas and feedback from people if that is something that they would potentially like to explore, and if you'd like to work with us to perhaps develop any ideas around it. There's also, as I said earlier, a lot of interest on the part of the Commission in supporting these sorts of ambitions. There has long been that desire to work more closely with California, and the door is certainly open from the Commission side on that conversation as well. So that's really all I wanted to say at this point. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar, including with all our contact details with you and with the people who couldn't make it. If people want to reach out to us directly about this, and particularly in terms of sharing your particular views or having discussions with your cities or your networks, please do that. We'd be very keen to explore that further. And just again to thank you for your time for this, and for Peter for his support, and for the team more widely, and for Sam for opening us as well. So I'll stop there. If anyone has any immediate thoughts, please feel free to share, and if not, I'll hand back to Sam.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. So this concludes this meeting. Have a good day.
Thank you.